we can get started. Thanks for coming this morning. It's my pleasure to introduce Anton. He has a bachelor's degree from Loyola College in Baltimore, Maryland in business. Moved on to North Carolina State where he has a master's and a PhD from Tennessee State. And he's done a lot of great research in a lot of different areas: marketing, price and policy in agriculture, cropping systems, and economics of education and information. So it's a real pleasure to have him. He has a lot of K-State connections, so that's kind of exciting. I guess he was recruited into agriculture by our friend and colleague Barry Goodwin. And at Montana State, he's done a lot of work with Gary Brester. And here at K-State, he's been here a lot, and he's worked with Michael and Brian Brigham and Glenn Conser. So we've got a lot of great connections here, and we're really glad to have you here.
Yeah, well, thanks, and thanks for the kind words. I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you for inviting me here. And I guess what I want to just give you so this research, it's evolved. It's kind of this amalgamation of a topic and then lots of little branches that have evolved from it and are still evolving from it. And really the big topic here is looking at marketing and market structures within evolving grain markets. And I think as I'll talk about in a little bit, there's been quite a bit of change in grain markets over the past decade or so, especially in the wheat marketing side of things. And I think it's really interesting to try to understand why those changes have come about, where they're going, and try to get some insights that might be helpful for those in the industry and those who might benefit from the information. I know that I've met with some of you this morning, and I've said this. I've been pretty open about it. That this is a really it's really exciting to have an opportunity to potentially be a colleague here. When I came to MSU, I really got interested in wheat markets, and I think it's a really fascinating crop. I think it's much more than just a commodity. There's lots of interesting quality considerations and different market considerations there. And I think Kansas supposedly grows a little bit of wheat. So coming here and really being involved with the wheat industry here and learning from the stakeholders and getting a sense of the issues that are important, timely, and relevant here, and then doing the research and then giving answers back to those stakeholders. I think it's a really neat way of being in academia and having some impact. And so that's really where this position is of greatest interest to me, is being able to have a lot of impact. So before I get really into this paper, what I want to do first is I know I'll meet with some of you face to face and talk in more detail. But for those that I won't have that opportunity, I just want to give you a 5 to 7 minute overview of where I am professionally, what my goals are, what my interests are, and really, like I said, my big area of interest is in that intersection of ag marketing, market structure, looking at the evolution of that market structure and how things are changing within the competitive nature of those markets, and really across the supply chain. Although my research is focused, and this is where I'd like for it to continue, is looking at kind of the base level of that production supply chain, really looking at the producers and a few levels up through that supply chain. I'm certainly interested in the consumer side. Obviously, everything is driven from the consumer side, but that's not my main area of focus. So those have been really the big interest of mine. That's where I would like to continue going here at K-State, and I think given that the ag sector is a really important part of this economy in the state, I think this will be a really nice fit. Certainly I have experience and I'm interested in looking at sort of the risk analysis. I think anytime you're in agriculture, you have to think about risk and thinking about, within this market evolution of grain markets, how does risk come in? Obviously, anytime markets change, there's going to be exposure to different types of risk. And really understanding what factors are influencing that exposure, what factors are driving the risk, and then looking at both the market tools that are available and the policy tools that are available to deal with that risk. I have some of my papers and some of my research have focused on that. And part of that risk is coming from the production side and the farm management side. And I've been able to, and lucky enough to work with some really good colleagues in other departments, the agronomy department, soil science, land resource, to really think about really where does grain production start, and how do producers respond to changes in markets, how do the grain handling side respond to changes in markets. I've been able to look at Montana's experience in quite a bit of transition now from a very traditional wheat fallow system to more intensified systems, and really learning about how that's changing, what influences producers to take advantage or not take advantage of that, looking at what are the risks that come with it, and what are the expected returns. And I know that there's a lot of research into new crop varieties, into responding to consumer demand in terms of what types of wheat characteristics are produced, that's done here. And so I think there's some really interesting lessons and collaborations that exist here. And certainly, I come from NC State, so econometrics is a big part of my portfolio. Part of one of my bigger focuses in the applied econometric side is looking at spatial and temporal issues. That goes all the way back to my PhD work, and it's kind of been throughout. And you'll see in this this presentation is a really nice characterization of those interests there. That I think if you're looking at production side economics in agriculture, it's really hard to avoid spatial issues and spatial dependencies and the fact that if I'm trying to look at the evolution of markets, time is obviously important as well. So applied econometrics within that scope is really interesting, and certainly to me it's looking at new methods, not necessarily that methods. So I don't think that methods should drive the question. My philosophy is that the question should then drive want to look for the methods that are best suited for answering the question. But that's certainly that's where I go. In terms of pedagogy, I came from NC State where I had I've been there. I was there for 4 years. I had a research assistantship throughout, and so I didn't teach any classes at NC State. And when I got to Montana State, I was kind of thrown into the fire. And my first semester was not the prettiest of semesters. But really, that kind of weakness and knowledge of that weakness, I really started to think about, well, what can I do to improve? And I started to read a lot of, education in economics, books and journal articles, and really got interested in just pedagogy research, and really where that's driven me right now is to really implement this integrative pedagogical approach. Where the learning environment is not just the unilateral, I teach you facts and you learn them and then I don't know what you do with them, but really taking that discovery where I teach and then students go out and they do some research on their own and they learn new information on their own, and then they take that back and engage their peers, other classmates, they engage me, and then also one of the more important things is they engage stakeholders. So they take that new knowledge and they bring it back to the industry, the producers. So sharing that information, getting those connections, I think that's a pretty central theme in how I want to set up a learning environment, and that's where I want to go with that. Outreach, I think outreach is really important. We have a pretty small department at MSU, not a lot of extension folks, so a lot of that communication back to the agribusiness and to the producers, it falls onto kind of the traditional research and teaching, which I think it's great. One of the things that I like a lot is doing research that matters, and that's where the outreach comes in. There's a lot of interaction. I get a lot of my questions from talking to producers, talking to businesses in the ag sector, and you know, doing that research in a rigorous way that can inform both the academic community and then bring it back and inform the agricultural sector. That's where I think that outreach component becomes really important. Another thing that I've been really thinking a lot, and I'll show you at the end of the presentation here, of one way that I've tried to do this is I've really been thinking about new and innovative ways to communicate that outreach. Obviously, with a research and teaching component or appointment, it's you can't do 50 presentations a year around Montana where it takes 9 hours to drive from one point of Montana to another, and you're still in the same state. I come from the East Coast, and so driving 9 hours, you go through 6 states, very different in Montana. And so there's, you know, thinking about how do I communicate effectively such that that information is accessible but also important. And I've been thinking a lot about that. And then obviously strong stakeholder networks, that's where the questions come in, that's where the new ideas come in. And having those is, I think, really pretty critical. So that's kind of an overview of where I'm going, and all of this is really, again, it's within this idea of evolution of markets and how things change. And in grain markets, what we've seen in the past decade or so is an evolution that's really been driven toward a more crop-centric environment. So, you know, whether it's policy-driven through the ethanol mandates, whether it's, you know, technology-driven with, you know, herd numbers reducing, but land is not used for cattle because we can get more meat out of a single animal, and so where does that land go? Perhaps it's going into crop. Some of it is also driven by these new markets that are emerging with export, and so that Asian influence has really been a big component of this transition to a more crop-centric sector in the U.S. That, you know, there's these new markets and where population is growing and income is growing, and so there's a lot of export demand that's happening, and that's been a big driver of different cropping practices and different practices in agriculture. Certainly another factor that's contributed to this evolution in the grain markets is this increased demand for transportation services. And you know, we felt it quite a bit in Montana, and I know that it's been felt here just by looking at rail rate information for cars here in Kansas and other states in the Midwest. But you know, that there's been a lot more demand. If you're producing more of something and yields keep growing and there's more demand from further distances, you have to transport that grain a longer distance and transport more grain. So when an infrastructure is 100 years old or maybe older, that demand is going to affect how that transportation happens and how those grain markets respond. And so obviously with increased competition as well, with the oil boom that's been happening, like I said, in the past 2 or 3 years, that's been felt quite a bit in Montana because of that huge boom that happened in eastern Montana. But certainly there's been effects here in the Midwest as well. And so that has prompted quite a bit of change in the grain industry, and specifically in the grain handling part of that supply chain, that grain handling industry has evolved as well. And looking at wheat markets, what we've seen, the response to those changes is this renewed entry of these higher capacity, higher speed shuttle loading facilities. So these are much larger facilities that can handle a lot more grain. They have a lot more storage and capacity, and they can load and unload that grain a lot faster. And it's renewed because and I'll talk about it in a few seconds that it happened in the 80s first, but now it's happening in response to this greater demand for wheat. And really, there's been these two goals. There's probably more goals, but the two main ones that I've noted, and just from talking to elevator managers, is one is to reduce the handling and transportation costs. If there's higher demand for transportation, higher rail rates, one way to get around those extra costs is to build more cost-effective handling facilities, right? So these are larger. They can get better rates from railroad companies by loading larger unit trains, 110 usually car unit trains, at a much faster pace. And so if they can, and obviously take economies of scale, efficiencies, and other technological improvements in newer facilities, what they can do is take advantage of those and reduce their costs, right? So if their cost of handling and buying grain, obviously prices have been are higher, than what can these businesses do to reduce costs? This is one way. The second is to capture marketing opportunities, right? If there's increased demand from export facilities, they're exporting to Asia, and there's higher demand there, then what can I do? And that demand is growing, and it's going to continue growing. What can I do as a grain handling facility? Well, I can build a larger facility that can ship and meet those demands at a lower cost, and then capture those additional revenues. So really a very, I think, very straightforward economic goal, two goals of, that are very based in economic theory. When this happened in the past, back in the 1980s, this is when the rail industry got regulated, deregulated with the Staggers Act, and a lot of these larger capacity unit train loading facilities came into the Corn Belt and the corn and soybean production areas. And there's been a few studies. There's a Ford and Berry study in the late 80s. There's the Hauser study in the late 80s that have looked at the effect on producers. So if these elevators are saving in terms of costs, then potentially they have the opportunity to pass some of those cost savings on to producers. Does that actually happen? And that literature has really not found, it found some effects, not much. And there's been a theoretical model with Hauser that they said, well, in some market structures there may be more pass-through, in others there may be less, but really not a lot of empirical evidence to support that these cost savings are being passed through. Here's the issue with those studies. One is they're 30 years old, so maybe things have changed a little bit. The second is they really focused on the production area where markets are very homogeneous, right? So many producers, they're growing a very commodity type of crop. It's corn and soybean mostly, large yields. There's lots of grain handling facilities, and there's very limited on-farm storage, so everything goes immediately to the grain facility, and then it's shipped out or stored at that grain facility. So not a lot of market power by the producers themselves. And really, at that time, a lot of the commodities were marketed domestically. And there was some export, but much of it stayed in the United States, went to feedlots, etc. This is where the wheat markets, this is where they offer a really neat opportunity and a really neat kind of a natural experiment to revisit this issue and to look at how the evolution of market structures in the wheat market, maybe there's a difference there. Okay, and these two states, right, Kansas and Montana, they provide a really nice way to exploit that difference. So if we think about the two states, they're both large producers of wheat, but the market structures are very different in these two states. And if we think about Kansas, right, very similar to kind of what previous studies have looked at, lots of producers, not a lot of on-farm storage. There's lots of grain handling facilities, I'll show you that in a second. And there's lots of marketing channels, right? So depending on the year, that wheat might go to domestic consumption, it might go out west to be exported. So really it depends on the year and the marketing environment. In Montana, things are quite a bit different, right? There's many fewer producers. There's not a lot of grain handling facilities. There's almost 100% on-farm storage, right? So if we produce up to capacity in Montana, we can store most of the wheat on farm. Right? That's absolutely possible. So you don't have to sell. So if you think about kind of the classical two-period storage model, right? The upward sloping demand curves comes from the fact that there's market power from those producers and keeping that grain in bins. And it's actually with lower prices today, that's what I've heard has been happening. Grain elevators are really struggling to acquire wheat because farmers are waiting for prices to go up. They're not going to be happy because the next 2 years are forecasted to be lower prices. So really there's in Montana, because there are fewer facilities, there's a lot more spatial dispersion across those facilities. And the marketing channel, it's very consistent. Almost all of the wheat goes west. It goes to the Pacific Northwest, the Vancouver, the Portland export facilities, and then goes to Asia. So really nice opportunity, and here's a visual characterization of those differences, right? So here's Kansas. Each dot is a grain handling facility. The red dots are those more efficient, higher capacity shuttle loaders, and the size of the dot, it indicates the relative storage capacity. So lots of really big elevators and lots of pretty spatially clustered elevators in Kansas relative to Montana, where there's many fewer elevators. They're quite a bit spatially dispersed, and they're not as big. And they're not as big because they don't have to be, right? There's a lot of on-farm storage. Yeah.
So what explains the buildup in on-farm storage in Montana?
So typically, so in Montana, it's a very dry climate. So typically, the only thing that for many years, the only thing that you can grow are those small grains. And the small grains, especially in this northeastern part of Montana, where there's a lot of spring wheat, the yields have been relatively low. So it's not like a Midwest state where you grow corn and it's 150, 160 bushel. There's just no way that you're going to store that much on farm. Here you can. Here you can build enough of those bins that you can store on farm. And really, a lot of that happened in the kind of the 1970s, where there was a boom. There was a lot of bins that were installed, and there's been almost no change over time. And just to show you what that storage looks like, so this is in 2014. I just included a couple of the big production crops in the States. And grain production, we see Kansas, over 1 billion bushels of various grains produced. On-farm storage capacity, not nearly as much. I mean, 3 times less than what's produced. Montana is the flip side, right? If everything was planted into wheat, into winter wheat, which is higher yields, even, we would be able to store it. So quite a bit of differences in those two market structures, which really makes this research really interesting. So here are the 2 things that we wanted to do here. Given these different market structures, first what we wanted to do was think about the model here. Well, how can we model potential differences in pass-through that occurs from the elevators that are more cost-effective to the producers in these 2 different market structures? Okay, so can we explain? Can we try to formalize what's going to happen given the differences in those 2 market structures? And then the second question is, well, we have this really nice natural experiment where we have this single commodity, it's produced in 2 states, but the marketing structures are very different. And so can we, and at the same time, in the past 10, 15 years, we've seen a similar increase in the number of those shuttle loading facilities happen in both states. So very similar conditions, very similar environments, but the market structure is different. So what can we do to measure potentially differences and ask, empirically, is there a difference? And if there is, how much is that difference out there? Okay, so first to motivate and to put together this kind of this theoretical idea and put this model together, here are the 3 working assumptions, which I think are fairly straightforward but necessary. that we're going to assume about shuttle loading elevators. First, they have lower costs because of their technological efficiencies and more favorable rail rates. We look at the data, that's absolutely the case, and so there's at least anecdotal evidence from tariff rates, rail rates to suggest and to defend this. The second assumption is that, as I mentioned, these elevators, they can pass through. They don't have to, but they can pass through these cost savings and still maintain some competitiveness within the market, within these other elevators that don't pass through those savings. And then the third assumption is these are firms. They behave rationally, so they're going to minimize costs. So if they don't have to pass through those savings, they won't, because passing through those savings is going to be like incurring a higher cost. So those are our three working assumptions, and from here, what I did was I put together this cost function. It's a variable cost function. It starts out, very straightforward. Econ 101 stuff, where we have this input cost. So this is going to be for an elevator, this is the price that they have to pay for grain, and then the Q, that's how much grain they have to buy. But then when we look at these two elements a little bit closely, here's what that cost and quantity look like. So that cost, we can think of it as being a function of two things. One is B, which is the basis level within the region. So if we look at a certain geographic area, there's going to be some basis level, so the difference between futures price and local cash price. That's for that region. So it depends on transportation costs to a futures market delivery location. It depends on the local production conditions, local demand and supply conditions. All the other factors that go into establishing that local basis. But for a shuttle loader, there's also this second factor, which is a premium. This additional price premium that they can add to that basis. So if that shuttle loader wants to raise that basis just for that location, they can add a premium to that regional basis. That's that pi factor. And this premium is itself a function of, I'll just say three things. One is just to showcase kind of why we think this model is reasonable, which is this Q min. So if we think about a shuttle loading facility, it has to be able to get those lower rail rates. It has to have some minimum amount of grain it has to load on a unit train and ship off. So, depending on the length of that train, sometimes it's maybe a little bit shorter than 110 cars, maybe it's a little bit longer. That Q min, that minimum amount that they have to load, might differ. Okay, and if we think about the difference between a conventional elevator, a smaller one, and a shuttle loader, that Q min is certainly going to be different as well. The second factor that I'm going to talk about is this. This is the spatial competition factor. This is what we're really interested in. Okay, so this factor talks about, okay, what is the distance between the shuttle loader and other competitors within some reasonable geographic market area. Okay, so this is the distance to other, we'll just assume conventional elevators. We can generalize it to be other shuttle loaders, but just to make it easy, we'll talk about just distance to other conventional elevators. And then Z is some other factor. And then when we think about the amount of grain that they have to acquire, it's also a function of this minimum amount. So how do we think about what the impacts of different market structures might be? Well, let's take some derivatives and see what they suggest. So just to show you, let's first look at this quantity requirement, and this is what I said. Well, let's think of something that is relatively straightforward and that can show that this model is fairly reasonable. So let's say that minimum amount goes up. So now we have to, as a shuttle loader, we need to, all of a sudden there's a higher order that we need to fulfill, and so we need to incentivize farmers to deliver more grain to that shuttle loading facility so that I can fulfill that order. Okay, so If that minimum goes up, there's two avenues that affects that cost, that variable cost. One is I just need to buy more grain. Okay, so cost is just going to go up because I'm buying more of that good. And the second factor, the second avenue is through that price premium that shuttle loader can add to the regional basis, right? So if I need to buy more grain, I need to create higher incentives for farmers to deliver that grain, and so I'm going to add to that basis level some premium, and that's going to increase my input costs, which is then going to, all this together, lead to higher costs. So that's kind of why this model, I think, works. So now let's think about how the spatial competition structure affects this cost. And so the only part where that distance comes in is through that premium. Okay? And so what we want to show, and this is, I'll show you the next slide, is that the more dispersed those elevators are, the higher the premium that a shuttle loader has to place on that basis level. Okay, and if that's the case, then that's going to raise costs through that input price avenue and lead to higher costs. Okay, so why do we think that is? So here's a stylized depiction of the spatial competition model, and if you want to think about it as this being Montana and this being Kansas, more generally, this might be an area where there's more spatial dispersion, and this is an area where there's less. So let's start here. So here's a shuttle loader that's right in the middle, and that shuttle loader is offering some regional bases, which is true for this entire region here. And this farmer 1, which is in the box, it delivers only to that shuttle loader because there's no other elevators, which are marked by these Cs, conventional elevators, that are nearby, right? So this farmer delivers, and that farmer's hauling cost to the shuttle loader is 5 cents a bushel. And so within this region here, within this very dark region, that shuttle loader really doesn't have to pay above the regional basis level, because that farmer is going to deliver to that location anyway. But let's think of this farmer 2. This farmer 2 can deliver to this conventional elevator here for half a cent a bushel, or they can deliver to the shuttle loading facility here for 2 cents a bushel for hauling costs. So in order to incentivize farmer 2 to deliver to the shuttle loading facility, that facility has to pay a minimum premium of 1.5 cents a bushel, so that farmer becomes indifferent to either delivering to that conventional elevator that's closer by, or to delivering to that shuttle loader. And so any marginal increase above that 1.5 cents a bushel, if we purely think about economics and not talk about behavior and things like past relationship with elevator managers, and maybe your in-law is the manager of an elevator, and then you have to go there. Let's just think that farmer is completely rational. So if there's a marginal increase above this 1.5 cents a bushel, they're going to deliver to that shuttle loader. So in this area, any farmers in this slightly lighter circle, they will get a 1.5 cent a bushel premium. Again, if we think about this farmer 3, 5 cents to deliver, or half a cent to deliver to the conventional elevator, 4 cents to deliver to the shuttle loader. So the minimum premium that the shuttle loader has to place above the regional basis is 3.5 cents a bushel. So if this is done, then farmer 3, farmer 2, and farmer 1 are getting a 3.5 cents a bushel premium. We'll just assume that there's no price discrimination going on here. And this is a pretty reasonable assumption if you're getting grain from a relatively large radius. And so what we're going to see on average is a producer getting a significant or a higher pass-through. Okay, in a less spatially separated environment where there's lots of conventional elevators around a shuttle loader and lots of farmers, And for that farmer, for each one of these farmers, the way that I've modeled here is that they can deliver to a conventional elevator for ½ cent a bushel and to a shuttle loader for 2 cents a bushel, but the pass-through is going to be only 1.5 cents a bushel. And all of these farmers are going to be getting the same pass-through. There's not going to be this differentiation relative to the hauling cost. The farm gate for a farmer in this less spatially separated environment is going to be much less. So if we think about these distances between elevators, the shuttle loader and the conventional elevators, as being, if we think about it mathematically, proportional to the hauling costs of farmers in that region, then we can see that it's really the hauling cost and the incentives that shuttle loader needs to place on the incentives that shuttle loader has to create in terms of adding premiums to that regional basis in order to get that grain to that location. So the more spatially separated we think is going to have a larger pass-through, and the less spatially separated is going to have a lower pass-through. Okay, so that's what we think is going to happen. That's our hypothesis there, that that's what we should observe if our model is correct. And so what we want to do now is test it empirically. And the way that we're going to test this empirically is to think about looking at different basis bids across time and across space between shuttle loading locations and these non-shuttle loading conventional elevators, and see if there is a difference in those bids, and if there's a consistent difference in those bids, and see, does market structure have anything to do with it? And as I've said in the past, right, the difference between the Montana market structure and the Kansas market structure provides a really nice ability to do so. So here's a quick overview of what we're going to do here and what data we're going to use. So the data come from two sources. So these are cash price bids at elevator locations. Most of it comes from DTN data, and it's really good for Kansas elevators. It's not so good for Montana elevators, and so we go to a second source, which is this GeoGrain data set. Maybe some of you have worked with it, maybe not, but this is a former extension economist who was at MSU and then decided that you could make a ton more money by going to the industry and just collecting cash prices and selling to farmers, and that's exactly what he's been doing. But it's a really nice data set. So this supplements some of the Montana data. To get those bases, we use future CRV data, and then some other industry sources for things like what's the capacity of an elevator, is it a shuttle loader, et cetera, et cetera. The time range is really nice. It covers 9.5 years, so it's lots of time to look at. And then the initial, I'll talk about why I say it's initial frequency. It's daily. We'll transform it to weekly for a particular reason. I'll talk about it in a second. So here's the difference. We already saw the elevator difference visually, but here it is in numbers. So many more elevators in Kansas. Even though the proportion of shuttle loaders in Kansas is smaller, just levels, it's going to be more shuttle loading facilities here. But the idea that there's you have to deliver a longer distance potentially from Montana to those export facilities. Maybe this is why there's more proportionally higher in Montana. Rail access, about the same capacity, quite a bit larger in Kansas. Again, this on-farm storage story here. And then this is, so the average number of elevators, this is just to give you an idea of the spatial competition that exists in those two markets. This is within a 60-mile radius, so there's some research, it's unpublished, it's a report from the North Dakota Department of Transportation and the Montana Department of Transportation, where they show that typically the maximum radius within which farmers will deliver to a shuttle loader is about 60 miles. outside of which it doesn't make sense for those farmers to deliver. And so what I did was I took that and I said, okay, well, on average, for each elevator in our data set, what's the average number of elevators within that radius? And you can see that there is a lot more competition in Kansas than there is in Montana. Okay, across those two states, both the shuttle loader and non-shuttle loaders, all shuttle loaders have rail access, they have to. The capacity is fairly large, and as I was talking to the committee members this morning, there's this really interesting idea that, you know, there's a fairly low ownership of the shuttle loaders by co-ops, and a lot of this number, the reason that it's high, partly is that there's a lot of CHS shuttle loaders in Montana. And CHS is officially a co-op, even though it's global and a really big agribusiness. But really, the farmer-owned co-ops really don't go into shuttle loaders, and I'm curious as to why that is. And I think you know, working with folks like Brian to explore that issue would be really interesting. And non-shuttle loaders, obviously smaller, more co-op owned, and not all of them have rail access. Okay, so following some work that Michael, Glenn, and Kevin Duvetter have done on modeling basis, this is what we want our kind of initial model to be, where we have a basis on the left-hand side at an elevator at a point in time. We have a shuttle indicator, we have some lag bases, we have another lag basis for a year ago. We have some implied volatility of the futures market, so how do elevators respond to market volatility, uncertainty. We have this indicator for different sources of data, just in case there's potential difference there. And then a month, year, and counting fixed effects, just to try to get at some of the seasonal unobservables, some of the yearly marketing year unobservables, and different regional unobservables. So here's the issue with running that model as if just with an OLS. The issue is that we have spatial dependence, and there's lots of theory and past evidence of this in agricultural markets, largely because arbitrage opportunities, right? If an elevator raises its price, then farmers are going to arbitrage that price away pretty quickly by choosing to go to different locations. And in our data, we also see this quite obviously, that, you know, if we run a regression, very simple panel regression, we look at the residuals, we test them for autocorrelation using various methods, visual semivariograms, which is basically just a spatial covariance measure, and then some global autocorrelation statistics, and all of them pretty strongly indicate that we have spatial dependence. And so what we need to do is estimate a spatial panel model, which looks like this. And this is a very general form of this model. Here we have a dependent variable. We have a lagged spatial dependent variable. So this is the idea that price bids might be dependent across elevators within some geographic area. Some exogenous explanatory variables, fixed effects, and then an error term, which itself, those unobservables, can also have a spatial dependence. Okay, and the weighting matrix here, that is indicative of how spatially separated those locations are. So two issues of note here that have led us to some other considerations. So one is this observation frequency. As I mentioned, the raw data are daily. And this is really nice. If we think about, wow, what do we want? We want the higher the frequency data, the better, because we have lots more information and we can learn a lot more. Well, yes, that's true, except when it doesn't make sense within the scope of the modeling structure. So within a spatial panel model structure, that spatial panel can control for two things. It can control for that spatial dependence and temporal dependence, but it can't control for both spatial and temporal dependence together. Okay? So what that means is if we use daily data, what that would imply is that any dependence, any dynamics between when one elevator changes its price and the reaction of other elevators to that change, that dependence will be assumed to have dissipated within one day. Right? So if we use daily data within that spatial panel structure, we're going to automatically assume away any type of dependence that might go through more than one day. And typically, that dependent, and especially, I showed you that the autocorrelation, the dependence structures were indicated to be within 150, 160 mile radius. That can take several days. And so if we use a daily data set, we're not going to capture that. So instead what we do is we use weekly basis. So we aggregate, yes, we lose some information, but we allow for that spatial dependence and those price dynamics that happen within that week period to occur and to be captured. And so that allows, typically those price differences go away fairly quickly, but it can take several days. We think that a week is sufficient. The second issue, so this one was fairly easy to fix. Obviously, we can talk more about fixing this structurally within the model, maybe developing a new specification to control for both the joint space and time dependence. This is an easier fix to that, or more straightforward fix without really developing a new paper out of it. The second issue is that the weighting matrix, when we looked at these data, and these are basis data really coming from price data, there were some holes. Right? So we had an unbalanced panel, and the issue with holes in the data is if we go from a panel that's balanced, right? In a balanced panel, each cross-section is the same. So in each cross-section, we have the same number and the same players, the same elevators in each cross-section of that panel. Which means that the distance between those elevators, that weighting matrix, is always going to be the same. Right? It's going to be an n-by-n weighting matrix that can be used for each one of those cross-sections. That makes things a lot easier because to estimate the covariance, we need to invert that n by n weighting matrix. And even if you have a 500 by 500 weighting matrix, with the computing power that we have now, that's no problem to do that. The issue with an unbalanced panel is now each cross-section has different players, right? So for each time period, we might have a different set of elevators, which means that that weighting matrix has to be different for each cross-section. So instead of having an n by n weighting matrix, we now have an nt by nt weighting matrix, which requires us to invert a matrix that's very, very large. So with Kansas, on a weekly basis, we would have to invert 126,000 column and row matrix, and for Montana, 14,000. There's no amount of computing power that I've been able to find that can do that. So it's impossible, as far as I see, currently to estimate these types of weighting matrices. Just a quick note, I am working on a paper right now that's looking at developing new methodologies to do just this in the spatial panel, primarily through a Bayesian learning network. So trying to separate those cross-sections, estimate them separately, and then within the Bayesian structure of informing priors, put them back together, and in that way estimate an unbalanced panel model. I haven't seen a lot of research on unbalanced panels. Mostly they've been applied in macroeconomic trade type policies where you don't have a lot of a large enough unbalanced panel that you can't estimate it. So that's the project going forward, and I think this will be this was a great motivation to do that, and I think it will be a really nice contribution there. So how do we try to solve this? For this project, how do we try to solve this issue? One way that's been suggested, and this is primarily in other disciplines, kind of the regional science, the geography, the ecology, literature that's been used quite heavily is to balance that panel through imputation. So we have missing observations. Let's try to impute those missing observations and force that panel to be balanced. And there are two ways of going about it. One is a single imputation, which is basically, look, let's just do a single out of sample forecast. We're going to use our existing data to estimate some parameters, and then we're going to, for the missing observation, we're going to input the data, the information that we know, and get some estimate. Okay, and it's an easy and fast way of doing it. The issue with that approach is it only provides a single point estimate. Right? So if we have missing observations and we do out of sample forecasts, anytime that you submit a paper, that I have submitted a paper, I won't put words in anyone else's mouth, but anytime that I've submitted a paper that does out of sample forecast and has a single point estimate, I get a review comment back that says, wait a second, you need to account for the fact that there might be uncertainty in your prediction. So this is the issue here. So to overcome this issue, there's this approach of multiple imputation, which is again based on this idea of Bayesian and choosing new priors and choosing new starting values, where you say, look, we have a missing observation. We really don't know the truth. We don't know what it is. But let's assume different starting points, different priors about what that value might be, and estimate it. And then let's choose a different set of priors and estimate it again. And let's do this a number of times so that we can get some estimate for that missing value, but we can also have some idea of the uncertainty around that estimate. And that allows us to have some idea that, look, yeah, we're going to be not quite right about what those missing values are, but at least we have some idea of how wrong we are. And if we're not too wrong, maybe we can go ahead with it. The issue here is that it can be computationally intensive. It took a while to do this, but not too bad. And here's very quickly the mechanism under it. So it uses this expectation maximization algorithm, which is based on Bayesian Bayesian statistics. And the big assumption that we're making is that our data are missing at random, in that we don't know, there's no trend for the missingness, so there's no like underlying factor that can affect the reason that those data are missing. We're just assuming that they're just, for some random reason, they're not in the data set. And so that allows us to assume that we can use the data that we've observed to estimate those missing observations. And so the way that we're going to do this is we're going to use this observed data to estimate some parameter vector and then predict this missing value. Okay. Sorry, one more note on this. This is where the uncertainty and the different priors come in, so we choose a different prior for that parameter vector. Okay, so identification strategy of that parameter, Bayesian and CMC. For this, we go back to using daily basis, and this is really an information point, right? Daily information provides a much richer data set and would more likely give a better sense of what those missing values are, rather than using those aggregated weekly data sets. So we make this model of these observed daily bases as flexible as we can, so it's a third-order polynomial. We don't really care about things like multicollinearity. We just want the best out-of-sample forecast, and since we don't care about multicollinearity or learning anything about that parameters, the parameter vector of that model we can use as flexible a model as we can, and then we use leads and lags for each elevator location, saying, okay, well, we have let's learn about the information that occurred before we reached the missing value. Let's learn about the information that occurred after the missing value, and use those sets of information to predict it. And then we impute 20 different data sets for each one of those states. Okay, 3 validation strategies. So how wrong are we in predictions? One is to compare the distributional properties of the imputed values versus the distributional properties of the observed values, and if they're pretty close, hey, that's good. We can also look at, compare the imputed values relative to what we've observed in the actual data and say, you could, if yesterday's basis bid was, minus 20, and we're missing tomorrow's, and we're missing today's basis bid, and we predict it to be, negative $1.50, that seems like a pretty big jump, and we probably got something wrong. But if it's negative 22 or negative 18, that seems like a much more reasonable imputation. And then the third approach is using these cross-validations. So here what we do is we use just the observed data, and we pull one observation out, and we say, okay, we pulled it out, we're going to treat it as missing. We're going to use our imputation approach to predict that value, and then see how close it is to the truth, since we know what the truth is. And if those match fairly well, then we know our imputation approach works fairly well. Okay, so I'm going to just show you for one Kansas location. This is fairly true across all of the others that we've seen. So this is the distributional kind of validation, right? So the red line is the kernel density of the imputed data. The black line is the kernel density of the observed. They're pretty dang close to each other. Here's the imputed values that are in red. The bars are the uncertainty over those 20 imputed data sets. The black values are the actual observed price bases. And what we see is they're pretty close, right? In times when we don't have a lot of missing values, our uncertainty about the imputed values goes down to almost nil. In places where there's a lot of unobserved information, we have more uncertainty, which is fairly straightforward. Okay, so now we have our data set. We've dealt with the timing issue. We've dealt with the unbalanced issue. We're going to estimate this using these weekly basis bids, and we're going to use a spatial weighting matrix. It's based on inverse distances. There's a couple other ways to estimate or to specify a weighting matrix. This is the most widely used. To be honest, we haven't tried any others. I don't think it'll make much of a difference because all of them are based on spatial separation. Then we estimate, so we estimate each model for each state for each one of these data sets separately, and then combine the estimated parameters together following Rubin's 1987 method. We use LM tests for a spatial panel to determine what specification we need. So I showed you a very general form of a spatial panel model, which had both an autoregressive term, so that's that lag dependent variable, and an autocorrelation term, which is that error, the spatial structure in the error term. The spatial structure in the error term, that's the SAC model. The autoregressive and the error term, that's that SERIC model. So we're going to test which model is more appropriate. We're going to use the spatial panel Hausman test to decide whether we should use the random effects or fixed effects model. And I think it's fairly common now that anytime we deal with data that overlaps this 2008-2007 period, we need to test whether there's structural differences in those estimates across those periods. Okay, so a quick summary of the specification tests. The Hausman test suggests a random effects model for both Kansas and Montana. This is, I think, good because Wooldridge also suggests that theoretically it makes sense that when we have variables that don't vary over time, like a shuttle loader indicator, a random effects model is more appropriate because the fixed effects model can bias the results. So it's good that the data actually supported this theoretical idea here. And then Boltagi's Lagrange multiplier test suggests two different specifications, an autoregressive or correlated model for Kansas and an autocorrelated model for Montana. Okay, so here are the results here. I want to leave a few minutes for questions, so I'll just focus on the parameter of interest here, and this is for Kansas. And what we can see, so this estimate for the full model, that's the average estimate across those 20 data sets, those 20 imputed data sets. this is the min and max estimate that we found. So it's very tight, so we feel pretty comfortable about this average estimate here. No effect, right? Statistically significant because we have a ton of data, so when an n goes to infinity, our significance goes very high as well, but really if we think about it from an economic perspective, economically non-significant at all. So really the shuttle loaders are not adding any premium to that regional basis at all, which tends to support the model the hypothesis that we put forward, that in much more clustered spatial areas and more competitive markets for delivery for those farmers for that grain, there's not going to be a lot of pass-through because of that hauling distance. And again, the pre and post 2007, really not much to say here. It's very similar across. Here's where kind of the really interesting insight comes in, the comparison with Montana. So here, the shuttle loaders do pass through for about 4 cents a bushel to farmers. So this is again supportive of the model that we've constructed and the hypothesis that we're testing, that in an area where we have more spatial separation, there seems to be some indication that pass-through is larger and is significant, right? And if you think about how much a grain elevator, a shuttle loader ships in a year, each shuttle train is about 380, 400,000 bushels. A shuttle loader might send 5 to 7 of those trains a year. That's a lot of bushels. And 4 cents a bushel for 1.5, 2 million bushels can add up to some pretty important numbers. So Montana certainly looks different than Kansas, and so it's certainly interesting. That's an interesting result in that. So what can we learn from this? So here's the comparison that I think it's really interesting to see visually, right? So this figure here shows, again, the number that I showed you in that summary statistics table, the proportional differences between the spatial clustering of these grain handling facilities in Kansas and Montana, right? So in Kansas, 26 versus Montana 3 within a 16-mile radius. And what we see here is that almost an inverse proportional relationship to the pass-through, that premium that's placed on a shuttle loading bid, a shuttle loader facility's bid in Montana and in Kansas, right? So in Kansas, very little, economically insignificant, while in Montana, proportionally much larger. So really striking comparison here for the spatial structure of this market, and here for the resulting differences in grain handling facilities behavior. Okay, so what can we learn from this? Well, one is there certainly seems to be evidence that in these different or in these different market structures, in these different environments competing for farmers' grain, and farmers being located further or closer together, there does seem to be a difference in behaviors of these grain handling facilities. And as we increase the density of those grain handling facilities, which in a sense is a signal for the proximity of farmers that can deliver to grain handling facilities in that region, that pass-through is going to decrease. Okay, and there also seems to be, so this isn't something that is directly that we directly test for in this research, but it certainly, if it quacks like a duck and walks like a duck, it's suggestive that there's some economic intuition here. There's at least some suggestive evidence that in a market structure where there's much more on-farm storage, where those farmers potentially have some market power in choosing whether to deliver to a facility or not, that premium is also going to be impacted by that market power. So if those shuttle loading
facilities have an order that they have to deliver in 2 to 3 weeks, and they don't have enough grain in their facility, that pass-through is going to rise because they need to attract wheat from a further distance, and they have to incentivize farmers to say, okay, this is the best price that I can get within the next year or two, and my storage costs are going to be sufficiently high in the next year or two that I want to deliver now and not wait until a better marketing environment. So certainly evidence of that here. Again, this is just suggestive of looking at those two states. So how is this informative for agribusiness and the choices of entering markets or not? Well, maybe this explains why co-ops are not entering those markets. Maybe they're recognizing the fact that, look, in some markets we really can't compete because our costs are high enough already, and maybe we don't want to incur those costs. Also, it's interesting what we're seeing in Kansas and in some other places where there's many more smaller facilities. When the shuttle loaders are entering into that market, those smaller facilities become intermediaries, right? They don't actually ship to the final destination, but they get the grain from the farmers, they store it there until that shuttle loading facility says, oh, we need to fulfill an order, let's buy that grain from those intermediaries. And so that means that this type of market structure is not likely to go away as those shuttle loaders continue potentially to enter or obtain more market power. Okay, so I'll end it here, and the one thing that I'll mention as promised, this is one of the ways that I've been thinking about communicating these types of research projects to a broader audience without actually going out there and doing talks like this. So I've been thinking a lot about, how do I structure my presentation in such a way that I can present it to a more academic audience here and then make it accessible immediately to others. And one way that I've been evolving into is making these presentations that really underneath it's an infographic, right? Infographics are very easy to read, lots of information in a small space, but there's lots of pictures, it's quick facts, and it's information that really matters. And this presentation, yeah, it was presented in slides, but really it's already on my website in the form of an infographic that you can go in and download and immediately see. So this is one way of the way that I've been thinking, okay, even though I have a research and teaching appointment, I still need to get this information back to folks for whom these results will matter most. And maybe this is one way that I can do this immediately without having to spend much more time making this into another presentation. And personally, when I see a PowerPoint that I have to download and go through the slides, that seems less appealing than looking at an infographic that makes things pop out. So that's one way. We can certainly talk more about other ways that I can do it. So I'm on here. There's 5 minutes left. I think this is like the optimal time where I don't want to leave too much time for questions, but there's enough. So I'll leave it here. Any questions about the research, where I'm going, my professional interests, others, please feel free.
Questions? I guess I have a question.
Sure.
Is the major interest in the shuttle loading because they're bigger facilities?
Yeah, so it's not only that they're bigger. So some of the research that I've done in Montana is partly they're bigger, partly they have the opportunity to pass through those cost savings. And what we've actually seen, talking to a producer representative who works on the BNSF board in Montana, and he was telling me that it's exactly what's happening right now in Montana is exactly what I thought was going to happen, which is always extremely validating. That when those when those shuttle loaders were entering and having to compete with those conventional elevators, they passed through a much higher amount in order to try to gain the market power and try to place those smaller elevators out of the market. What we see now, and hopefully we can get a little bit more data to see if the data show this as well, he is saying that once some of those conventional elevators got out of the market because they couldn't compete both on price and volume, no one wanted to deliver, and so they just couldn't fill orders, those larger shuttle elevators are now slightly reducing their price. And what I think might happen, because a lot of those shuttle elevators, at least in Montana, and this is also to some extent the case in Kansas as well, they're owned by larger multinational firms. And if you have the situation where if all of the grain is being shipped out by 3 or 4 firms who own all of the elevators in the same state, that might lead to monopoly. And so that's, I think in a few years we might have enough data to possibly test that hypothesis. But I think part of it is attracting the grain and being able to, if prices are, if everyone else has to lower their price because they don't want to incentivize more farmers to bring in grain because they're just at capacity, these shuttle loaders don't have to do that, and so that's where maybe the longer term relationships develop, and that's when I say, oh, well, this guy, I've been doing business with him for 10 years and now he doesn't want my grain. Let me go to this other new guy and start there. So I think it's a capacity issue, partly maybe to gain some market power, partly to fulfill orders, but I think a lot of the market power in terms of passing on costs is coming through those cost savings.
Yeah, related to that, I wonder with your great data, if you could use the capacity as an independent variable.
Yeah,
Also the total size, if it's just a single elevator or if it's one of the huge agribusiness firms, include those variables and get a measure of the kind of thing you're talking about.
So this is why I'm so excited to, we talked in the morning about Michael and I are getting our hands on these great data about volume. The issue here is because we don't have volume data, the only indicator, so if we put a shuttle indicator and a capacity indicator together in one model, they're going to be perfectly linear. So that's the issue why we couldn't use...
but what about just dumping the shuttle and having capacity?
It would probably be very similar, because there's a clear difference between the capacity and shuttle loader. I mean, there are a few elevators in Kansas that are not shuttle loaders, but huge capacity.
Yeah.
But on average, and maybe there's a nice case study
maybe
there.
That's why it's so small. I mean, it might just be a volume thing, and the shuttle doesn't really matter.
So maybe, so it's maybe one idea is to try to run a robustness test where we exclude those conventional large elevators and see if there's still a difference.
Or could you just put
Or
volume
just-
in instead of shuttle?
Well, we could put total capacity, but we
It has
wouldn't,
to be
yeah.
that capacity.
Sure,
Yes,
that's an interesting question. That's an interesting
The other question I had was how do you define a week when you go from daily to weekly?
Yeah, I mean, we take an average of those daily prices, and
For both the futures,
yeah.
the basis, and the...
Yep.
Okay. And how do you...
No. So what we do is we have daily data, and we impute the daily data, and then we calculate the basis on a daily basis, and then we aggregate, we take the average of the basis, not the average of the cash price and the futures, and take the basis, but first the basis and then the average.
Given what you're working with, I wonder if that definition of a week matters. Whether you need to go like Wednesday to Wednesday and test that and see if or 2 weeks instead of 1 week.
It could, and Michael and I have talked about this. The one issue, and maybe I dissuaded her too powerfully, the one issue that I see with that is because we have missing information, some Wednesday, some weeks we won't have a Wednesday, some weeks we'll only have a Monday. And so it's the trade-off between, well, let's use an imputed value and only an imputed value for Wednesday to Wednesday versus in a week, if we average that week, some are going to be imputed, some are going to be actual observed values, so maybe we don't lose as much. Maybe we're not fudging the data as much by aggregating and including some actual information and some imputed, rather than doing the week to week. And I'm totally aware of doing the week to week. I know that would be my preference because of some of the marketing issues there. But I think the nature of the data, it would certainly be worth a robustness test. And I think we should probably think about doing that and seeing if there's any difference. But yeah, that's a known concern. Thanks.
Thank you, very good. Other questions?
Yeah.
If you go back to the previous slide, see, I'm interested in both. You have that infograph, which kind of suggestive of one thing going on in your data, and then you have that last paragraph, and then you have the issue that kind of Andy was talking about, market power. Yeah, I don't really, I'm having trouble thinking, trying to think through the idea that there's both suggestive evidence of an effective pass-through from on-farm storage and from spatial structure, and possibly there's a market power issue. How do we distinguish between all those three?
That's a really good question. So in this research, I think I'm most comfortable talking about spatial dispersion. That's why I don't want to put too much emphasis on this on-farm storage issue. And I think I feel more comfortable talking about the spatial dispersion because we're looking at bids in elevators, and we know the distance across elevators. We don't necessarily know the location of farmers. The underlying assumption is that, as I mentioned, that the hauling costs are going to be proportional to the dispersion of those elevators. So I don't think an elevator would go into an area that's not central to a cluster of farmers. So I think that assumption it's reasonable, at least. We can certainly talk about the details. The on-farm storage, the argument that I guess I'm trying to make is that we have such different market structures in Montana and Kansas that perhaps the pass-through is also to some extent influenced by this storage. And if we had more information, more spatial information on storage capacity within an area, perhaps we could do exactly what you say, which is separate these two effects. Given this research, I think I would lean more towards the evidence that what we found is supportive of spatial dispersion and the competitive structure, the spatial competitive structure within a market of elevators, not necessarily farmers, but the stark differences between the on-farm storage in Montana and the on-farm storage in Kansas seems to suggest that there may be some other pass-through factors that are influenced by that storage. I think off the top of my head, that's the best answer that I can give.
And so your estimate's giving you how much more is the shuttle loading facility giving than the other elevators, right?
Yep.
Then could there be a question of, did the other elevators increase their basis, improve their basis in response to the shuttle facility? So the shuttle facility comes in, and then they have to up their
right. Yeah.
basis, so farmers could be
right. So this is, I think, one of the nice parts about these data, that we have a relatively long period, and we're trying to control away for lots and lots of things. And so this is an average effect, right? So this is, on average, what have we seen? And if we observe, so if this is the average, then if we observe shuttle loaders all of a sudden increasing their premium, we would expect, and that's being picked up in this model, that other conventional elevators would increase proportionally to that. But on average, what we observe is that there is a consistent 4-cent premium. So this isn't a story of, well, this happened once and then they raised it by 4 cents and then other elevators have adjusted. We're taking that adjustment away with the spatial panel. And so we're estimating an average effect after all of these adjustments and dynamics have been controlled for, which is part of the reason why we wanted to aggregate and use a weekly average, because then we could capture all of these adjustments that happen and not necessarily a daily where some of these adjustments may be missed.
Could you do a simulation where you have no shuttle facilities and you simulate the basis, and then you put in the shuttle facilities, and then that's going to your spatial, right, with the spatial model, it's going to diffuse, and you can see what the new basis is, and you could compare. Did that work? I'm not sure.
I don't know, I'd have to think about that.
Just see what
Yeah.
impact on total basis.
It's certainly, given as I mentioned, given some of the work that I'm doing with the trying to estimate an unbalanced panel, I'm doing that through simulation, so the tests are through simulation. So I think the framework is already at least halfway set up, so I think that that would be possible without too much new work. But yeah, I need to think about whether that's, how much more that would give other than what we found in the data.
Is there time for another one?
Yes.
So I'm wondering why, if your identification is based on the difference in spatial market stores, you didn't pull the data.
So we want to use these two states as a natural experiment, right? So we want to be able to say, so there are two reasons. One is we want to be able to exploit the fact that there's these two really, they're producing the same thing, but the way in that they're producing and then marketing that commodity is very different. And we want to exploit that difference to try to tease out some of the questions that, you know, so I'm not sure what your name is. What's your name? Yeah.
Ben.
Ben. So I'm not sure what Ben, so the issue is that we want to be able to do as much of the teasing out of the separate effects as Ben mentioned, with the constraints that we have in terms of the data that we have. So our strategy is, well, let's use this natural experiment in these two marketing structures in these two markets to try to get at that. The second reason is there are some structural differences in how wheat is treated and what wheat is. So, for example, in Montana, there's a lot of influence in protein level and quality. And so I think treating these two states as this and pulling them together, I think there's enough heterogeneity that we would not be able to control for with a state dummy variable. And the slopes and those other, so right, when you pull these two things together, you're assuming automatically that it's just an intercept change, right? And the slopes and everything else will be the same, and maybe you have an interaction term. But essentially, what we're doing is we're making an interaction term between a state dummy and all the other variables across all of the variables, and which is separating them.
Yeah, so that would be my concern, that these estimates are not really set expiry, right? I mean, they are conditional on all the differences in production, quality, aesthetic. So anyway, yeah.
Sure, and so that I guess maybe we're talking about the same thing. That's really the reason that we want to separate these two, right? So yes, those other parameter values or the other slopes, they may be influenced by quality differentiation that exists in the marketing landscape of Montana, and that doesn't at all or very much exist in the marketing landscape of Kansas. And so if we want to be able to account for those unobservables, I think pulling the data might create more issues than it might fix.
But then why do you estimate using two separate models? You use two different ways of estimating results.
Yeah,
When we're comparing them, and so in addition to Nelson's point, so how do we know that the differences are because of?
yeah, so essentially what those tests say is that, look, even if we estimate an autoregressive term in the Montana model, it would essentially be 0. So it wouldn't make a difference. If I had my laptop, I can estimate it for you and show that they're the same. But I've done it before, and that's essentially what's happening there. So my argument is they are the same models. We could certainly generalize it, but that generalization wouldn't give us much.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anton, for our next